Hi, my name's Carleton Young. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Tonight I'll be speaking to the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. And you know, when the Pittsburgh Pirates come to Milwaukee, they never get a very nice reception. But I'm hoping for a much better reception tonight as I tell the story of two Civil War soldiers from Vermont in my book, Voices in the Attic. The book is also available on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble, and or to contact me directly on Facebook. And so hopefully you will enjoy it.
The program will start in 5 minutes for the evening, and I'll ask Terry to come up and
Just go ask if you can have the card. Bring it on. Yes, yeah, just bring it up.
Carleton Young has undergraduate degrees in economics from Westminster College and in English from Point Park University, an MA in history from Ohio University, and his PhD in the history of education from the University of Pittsburgh. For 37 years, he taught AP American History at Thomas Jefferson High School. He's also taught classes as an adjunct professor at the Community College of Allegheny County, the University of Pittsburgh, Eastern Gateway Community College, and in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. As a result of the publication of his book, Voices from the Attic, he's been invited to provide programs to more than 250 different organizations around the country. And tonight he's also brought copies of his book, so after the presentation, he'd be happy, I'm sure, to autograph one for you if you want to take one home. So tonight's speaker, Carleton Young.
Yeah, thank you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to stand out in front here. I've developed a little bit of a balance problem where sometimes I start feeling a little bit lightheaded when I'm standing around too much. So I like having a chair. If I sit down, that's why. But it's getting older things. It kind of throws some curves at you sometimes, I guess. At any rate, thanks for inviting me to come tell my story tonight. And it's a story that starts with something which probably many of you in this room have had to experience, which is about 15 years ago, we had to empty out my parents' house. They lived in Pittsburgh, and they had passed away. And if you've ever had to empty out someone else's house, you know that there is a lot involved in that. You know, it's not just some furniture and appliances, but there's all that stuff. All the things in closets and drawers and storage areas. You're trying to decide, what are you going to keep? What are you going to do with all? Now, this was the house I grew up in. You know, I was not expecting to find much of anything I wasn't familiar with. But up in the attic, we found this very old wooden box that I'd never seen before. I brought it down, opened it up, and it was just jammed full of very old letters, which it turns out were letters written by two brothers who were in the Civil War. They were from Vermont. Their last name was Martin, Henry and Francis Martin. And so they were not only in the war, but they were members of what's known as the Vermont Brigade, which was a brigade renowned for their heroism and fighting ability. And in fact, if you looked up the Vermont Brigade on Wikipedia, the first sentence will tell you that they had the most casualties of any brigade in the Civil War. Now, there is this other brigade, known as the Iron Brigade, that some of you may have heard of. Certainly also very renowned for their fighting ability and very, very high casualties. And so, who had the most the numbers seem pretty comparable. And plus, it's rather difficult to come up with precise numbers of deaths and casualties in the Civil War. Even the most basic question, you know, how many people died in the Civil War? Was it 620,000? Or was it 750,000? Or maybe even as high as 850,000? You'll find historians will defend all those different numbers. So, but as I said, the numbers seem very, very comparable. Although one thing you can say about the Iron Brigade is they were not as large as the Vermont Brigade, and so on a proportional basis, the Iron Brigade had the highest casualty rate, certainly, of any brigade. But I think it's fair to say that these two brigades were probably the two best brigades in the Union Army, kind of similar to saying that the Pittsburgh Steelers and Green Bay Packers being the two best football teams in the history of the NFL. But at any rate, I found all these letters, and so, and there were a lot of them, and when I say there were a lot of letters, I've seen entire books based on someone having like 20 letters from a Civil War soldier, 40 letters, or 60 letters. Well, I had about 250. So it was an enormous collection. This is the box. Letters were all in their envelopes addressed back to the boys' parents in this little town of Williamstown, Vermont. So, as you heard, I had a background in history, but I'd never had any special interest in the Civil War. So the next step for me was to call in a couple of friends who were much more Civil War buffs, Ed Hale and Bill Lutz, who came over and they took a look at some of the letters and said, yeah, these are really well written, very good letters. We're going to have to do something with these. So the next step was to call in our wives. My wife Carol and Ed's wife Nancy, the five of us began to go through these letters together. We had weekly meetings to go through them. First thing we did was get the letters into acid-free folders to protect them, then get them organized in terms of who wrote each one, to whom, from where, get them chronological, get them all set up, and then start to read them. And reading the letters ended up being a rather difficult process. Here's an example of one of the letters. This one, I think of a piece of paper folded in half, so you have page 1 over here, 2 and 3 on the other side, and 4 over here. This one written by Henry, who enters first, writing to his brother from a camp in front of Richmond, Virginia in June of 1862. So this is during the Peninsula Campaign, very early in the war. He finishes the letter, signs his name down here. But then he thinks of something else he wants to say. Well, they had shortages of paper. He does not want to waste another sheet. So he turns the letter sideways and writes directly across what he's already written and signs his name a second time right there. So this was known as cross-writing. Civil War soldiers did this sometimes to save paper, and unfortunately our two brothers did this a lot. And so it made it really tough to read the letters. So for example, this is a month later, July of 1862. Once again, Henry writing to his brother, same thing, gets to page 4, turns it sideways, writes across it. Or another thing we found in the letters was, like in this next one, that sometimes as you get towards the bottom, he started writing really small, it'd be hard to read. Still didn't fit, so he went back to page 1, did some cross-writing up there. Or another thing, like the next letter, we found that sometimes when he'd be starting a letter, he'd be writing kind of slowly and carefully, be relatively easy to follow. But then, as the letter would go on, become increasingly sloppy and throwing in things down here. Or one last example, because I think this one has a little bit of everything. Not only does it become small and sloppy, but then he goes back to page 1 and writes all across it. So in our weekly meetings, the five of us would each have a copy of the letter. We'd be going through it to try to transcribe it. Lots of times we'd get caught, we'd end up stuck on a word. We might sit there for 2 or 3 minutes in silence or mumbling to ourselves what that word could be. And then usually someone would get it. And they'd shout out the word. We all say, yeah, that's it. And then we go to the next word. And on it went. So it took us a long time. It took us several years to get through these letters once. And then we went back and started all over again because we'd skipped a lot of words and passages, but now we knew the handwriting better, we knew their story. We were able to go back, fill in all the gaps, get these letters all completely transcribed. So that was the one thing we were doing those early years. The other thing we were doing was traveling a lot. We would go to the battlefields and show copies of the relevant letters to the park rangers and historians, and they were always really impressed with the depth these letters went into, but also traveling to the boys' hometown up in Williamstown, Vermont. So Williamstown is about 6 miles south of Barre, Vermont. And Barre, Vermont is where my father grew up. So we always knew these letters had to be connected in some way to my father's side of the family. Barry, in turn, is 6 miles south of Montpelier, the state capital, right in the center of the state. This Congregational church there in Williamstown was built in the 1820s. It is the church that our two soldiers grew up in. And first time we drove up there, we parked there in front of this church. And well, actually, just to jump ahead of the story a little bit, one of the things that really amazed us in these letters was how good the mail service was during the Civil War. That our soldiers down in Virginia, in their camps, would be getting letters and packages within mail just 2 or 3 days earlier from up in central Vermont. And since the mail service was that good, people would send care packages. They'd send perishable goods, food items. And one of the things that the church members from this church sent on several occasions was chicken pies. These big, like, chicken pot pies. And the boys would get into camp and eat them and be riding home thanking the church members. And so it was kind of funny, a few years ago, my wife and I were up in Vermont. We're driving through Williamstown past the boys' church. And in front of the church was a big banner that said, "Chicken pie dinner tonight." Turns out that's a fundraiser that a lot of churches do up in Vermont. And so we were able to go to the boys' church and eat that recipe for chicken pie. Sadly, though, last year a fire swept through the church and completely destroyed it. The only thing they were able to salvage was from up in the bell tower, a Paul Revere Company bell was the only thing left from the fire. But anyway, the first time we went up there, we parked there by the church, and right next to the church is a Civil War monument. We thought, boy, that's great. We came up to find out about our Civil War soldiers. There's a monument. We went over, started reading the names all around, walking around it, and our two brothers are not listed. We thought, this is crazy. We drove all the way to Vermont, right? But we have their military records. We know they're from here. We have the letters that are addressed here. And so this was one of many mysteries that made this whole project so interesting for us. Because for me, there was the mystery of, I knew my family history a bit. I'd never heard of anyone with the last name of Martin in our family. Had no idea if these soldiers were connected in some way to our family, or how they ended up in my parents' attic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or why my father never said to me, "Oh, by the way, you like history? You should see what I have. I have all these Civil War letters." None of this made a whole lot of sense, but this one we did, I think, get pretty well figured out. By going through old town records, we found that when they built this monument in 1869, they decided to only put on the names of the boys who were drafted to fill the town quota. Our two brothers enlisted. So they were not eligible. Now, why they did that, that we're not exactly sure. We're thinking there must have been some kind of political dispute or argument going to town to limit the names in that way, but that's what the town chose to do. Well, anyway, next to the monument, next building down there is the local historical society. So the first time we went up there, we stopped in, told the person inside a little bit about our letters. We said, we know this was a century and a half ago, but the boy's father's his name was Chester Martin. He said, have you ever heard of a local farmer, someone from around here named Chester Martin? And the person in the Historical Society said, well, sure, Chester Martin's house was right down the road. I'll give you directions. So down we went and we found the house. So this is the house that our two Civil War soldiers grew up in. That it's still there today, but now it is the front of like an assisted living complex. So they've taken out the back wall, built the assisted living area to the back and to the side. The original house is like the lobby and office area. So we had no idea we were going to find this. We go walking into our soldier's house, and it's all, that original house part, it's all decorated like Civil War era. So we go walking in, and it's like it was back at the time our soldiers were living there. Then we found out where they were buried, went up to the cemetery, we were walking along, looking at all the names and the markers. we saw this fenced-in section towards the back and thought, could that be? And sure enough, that was our Martin family. Chester Martin and his 4 children, wife, all buried there in the family plot. So it has just been one interesting find after another as we've gone through this. Well, as far as the 2 brothers go then, the first one I want to take a look at is Henry. His full name was William Henry Martin, but he went by Henry. And as far as we can figure out, Henry must have been a relatively friendly and well-liked person when his regiment was formed. And he was in the Vermont Brigade was the 2nd through the 6th Infantry Regiments in Vermont. And Henry will be in the 4th Vermont. It was formed just after the first Battle of Bull Run. And when it was formed, it's mostly young guys from the same county. Many of them have been in school together, they know each other, and they were allowed to select some of their officers. And they did select Henry initially as a sergeant, and so they must have liked him and respected him to some degree. But Henry's also someone, he's got a pretty good education, because this is a point in time, at the time of the Civil War, there were not yet public high schools in the United States. For children that were going to a public school, education would have usually ended about the 8th grade level. But then for families that had a bit more money, and as you saw from the house, this family was fairly well off, that those families would oftentimes send their children to private secondary academies. And Henry had attended Barry Academy, there in nearby Barry, Vermont. His brother Francis, we'll be looking at, attended Kimball Union Academy, which is a private residential academy in New Hampshire, which is still in operation today. And even their sister, Caroline, and this was especially a little unusual for back in those days for a young girl from a rural farming community to go off to a private secondary school. But Caroline had attended Mrs. Peabody's Select Family School for Young Women, which was located in the campus of Dartmouth College, there at Webster Hall. And so this is a family that very clearly values education. And I think that's one of the reasons their letters are so good, is because they knew how to write. And they really told their story of what was going on in the camps and in the battles and all the things they were experiencing. Then we had also, and with our letters, lots of handwritten orders from different officers. We had Henry's officer commission papers. And by eventually putting together my family tree to connect to these soldiers, I ended up finding a cousin who I didn't even know I had, but I contacted her, and she had Henry's sword. So there it is, W.H. William Henry Martin, Company A, 4th Vermont Infantry. So like I said, it's just been one find after another as we've gone through all this. So as far as their Henry's story then, going off into the war, that he will be heading down to Washington, D.C. area for his training, and traveling by combination of steamboat and railroad to get down there. He's never been far from home before, so it's a big experience for him. He to get there, of course, they have to go through Maryland. So that means going through, even though Maryland is in the Union, it's a slave state, so there's a lot of mixed opinion, and there had been cases of recruits being attacked by pro-Confederate mobs going through Maryland. So one of Henry's first letters then will be as they're traveling through that area. And he will write home to his parents. He says, "We passed through the streets where the Massachusetts men had been mobbed, but we did not have any trouble. Some people would wish us to bring back Jefferson Davis's scalp. Others would cry out, 'Hooray for Davis.' After dinner, we took the cars for Washington, left the cars, and marched to a place called the Soldiers' Rest. There we stacked arms, ate supper, spread our blankets, and slept the rest of the night. In the morning, we received orders to march to our encampment about 3/4 of a mile from the city of Washington. There we joined a large army of 40,000 men. I never saw such a sight before. There were thousands of cavalry, flying artillery, infantry arrived. The cavalry charging at full speed accompanied with flying artillery was a grand sight. So this is all very exciting for Henry at first. Now the camp where he's going to be located, I found that up in the Vermont Historical Society, we found this photograph of Vermont Brigade soldiers at their camp. Their camp was on the grounds of what is today the CIA headquarters. So I thought it might be fun to show up there someday and tell them about my letters and say, it's okay, I just walk around and check things out here and see what they have to say. But at any rate, they will be there for many, many months. And one of the things Henry does, which would not really have occurred to me, is he does get to do a bit of sightseeing. He gets to, he'll talk in his letters about crossing the chain bridge. I found this photo of this chain bridge during the Civil War time. And from the other side, then work his way on into the city, and he talks about walking past the White House and getting to tour through the Capitol building, and he goes to the Smithsonian Museum, and he's seen all the sights and having a great time. So things are going very well for a while. But then it's going to start to be a big problem. And the problem is disease. That, you've got the situation, all these young guys, many have never traveled far from home before. Now they're all mixed together in the camps. So you've got problems with immunities to diseases. You've got the fact they just don't know a lot about good health care and hygiene. And people start getting sick. So Henry writes home, after he's been there for a couple of months, he says, there's a great amount of sickness in the regiment. Charles Lynn's very bad, John Green's unwell, Fay's on the sick list, also Deck Jones, Cosgrove, Frank Flint. And his parents know all these people because, like I said, they're all recruited from the same area there. Measles and mumps prevail extensively. Newell Carleton is quite sick with typhoid fever, but we hope he'll soon be better. Was a friend of Newell, who had just been in school with a few years earlier, does not improve. In a later letter he says, as soon as he was confined to his bunk, I had him moved to my tent where it was more still and more spare room. He remained there about 2 weeks, received as good a care and attention as could be given under the circumstances. He was not in his right mind at nights, constantly spoke of his father, and was finally removed to the hospital, where he received pretty good care, but he grew worse every time his fever changed, and last Saturday night, about 8 p.m., he died. So that became the first of many friends and relatives of Henry who will die in this war. And as time goes on, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And a later letter says to his parents, when we left Vermont, my regiment numbered 1,100 strong, able-bodied men. Over 60 have now died of disease and a great number are sick. My regiment numbered 101. Today, only 36 privates are available for duty. So they are just having a terrible time with the illnesses, and it just keeps getting worse. In a later letter he writes, I see sights that would make any one of you at home shudder. Almost every morning we see outside the hospital a corpse of one of our fellow soldiers, there to remain until the next day. Finally, the corpse is dressed, placed in a pine coffin, and ready for burial. And up in the Special Collections at the University of Vermont, we found this photograph, which is Vermont soldiers at their camp burying some of their dead. Henry, in his letter, talks about what they do with these burial ceremonies, but kind of interesting the way he concludes the letter. He says, all of these scenes we become familiar with and think but little of. So it's just like, everyday things. Someone, they're out training, they stop, go bury some of their fellow soldiers, go back to their training, and on it goes for day after day and for month after month. Now, before we get to Henry actually going into battle, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other people in the letters, because we would go off on these tangents. Henry would talk about people from back home or people there in the camp with them, and we'd research them and find lots of interesting stories. One of the especially interesting ones is Uncle Isaac. Major Isaac Lind, Henry's uncle from this little town up there in Vermont. Isaac Lind was given the command out west early in the war, in fact way out west, all the way out in New Mexico. And very early in the war, a group of Texans, Confederates, came across the border. Isaac Lind took his men out to face them. not very many people are familiar with the Battle of Messina. It's not one of your big ones in the Civil War. But Isaac Lynn felt that this battle was not going well. He pulled his men back to his fort. But he also realized the Texans had artillery with them, so the fort was not going to really be defensible. So the next day, Isaac Lynn decided on a fast march to another fort. Unfortunately, some of his men just could not bear the thought of leaving behind their stores of whiskey. Many of them filled their canteens with whiskey. The next day, out in the hot desert sun, people are getting sick, dehydrated. Texans catch up with them, surround them. Isaac Lynn has to surrender all of his men. Now, this is in the Battle of Messina, there's only been a few hundred people on both sides, light casualties. In terms of the great scope of the Civil War, this does not matter a great deal. But Isaac Lynn had the misfortune of this happening just 3 days after the first Battle of Bull Run. So there had been this surprise defeat of the Union Army in the first big battle there at Bull Run, and now comes word they just lost something out west. So it doesn't go over real well. Isaac Lynn relieved of his command, so he comes back to Washington, D.C. to try to get a private meeting with President Lincoln. He wants to give his side of the story, what happened out west. And he will stay in the Vermont Brigade camp, because he knows a lot of people there. So Henry has a lot of letters home about Uncle Isaac being there with them and his view on things. He's staying there also because he has a son who's in the same, that's Henry's cousin, in the same regiment as Henry. But Isaac Lynn also has a daughter. His daughter, Louise, was married to Brigadier General Frederick Dent. Now, Frederick Dent, back in his school days at West Point, had been roommates and very close friends with Ulysses S. Grant. And in fact, he introduced Grant to his sister Julia, who Grant then married. So Henry's cousin, he's growing up in this little town, is not only married to a brigadier general, but she's sister-in-law to Ulysses S. Grant. And Isaac Lynn has another daughter. His other daughter, Mary, is married to Major Norman Fitzhugh, who is Assistant Adjutant General for General Jeb Stuart on the Confederate side. So it just amazed us that this town was so small, but the number of people we found that impacted the Civil War and the years that followed, just way out of proportion to the number of people in this town. But anyway, back to Henry and his training. It's going on for a very long time. This is in the Army of the Potomac under Commanding General McClellan. And of course, McClellan was getting a reputation for being perhaps overly cautious and slow-moving. So this training program is going on and on. And that kind of attitude is shown in Henry's letters as well. One letter he writes home, "We still remain at camp. You can see how many expectations we have and how few are realized. Soldiers remark quite often that they'll never have a chance of seeing a rebel if they stay in this army." So yeah, that was the feeling, like enough training already, let's get this going. And even though it maybe seemed like McClellan was just sitting around not doing anything, he actually is coming up with a plan. And so the plan he'll come up with is what's known as the Peninsula Campaign. So the idea will be to transport Army of the Potomac from coming down, I think my pointer just stopped working. Oh, there it is. Okay. So they're going to be coming by sea down to Fort Monroe and then moving up the peninsula, coming from the east, trying to avoid some of the Confederate defenses north of Richmond. And this is a blow up then, so they land at Fort Monroe down here and start moving their way kind of cautiously, slowly, moving up the peninsula, pushing the Confederate defenses back. There's going to be a lot of small battles fought during the early part of this campaign, and one of them is fought right here along the Warwick River. Now, once again, not very many people have heard of the Battle of Dam Number 1, but there it is, Dam Number 1. For Henry, this is a real significant battle because this is the first time he's ever actually gone to combat. You know, he doesn't know exactly what this is going to be like, and he will be writing home about the experience. When we visited there, I took this photograph, which shows Confederate earthworks that are still there today. The Vermont Brigade soldiers are going to be charging towards these Confederate defensive positions. So Henry says, "This was a memorable day in my experience, the first time I ever faced cold lead from an enemy's guns." And he talks about how they got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, had their breakfast, got words of encouragement from the officers, and then made the charge into this battle. He said, "Our colonel led the charge, flourishing his sword, encouraging his men on. Not a man flinched from his duty. It was a desperate charge, I'll assure you, in the face of thousands of rebels. My regiment lost only 10 killed. Other regiments suffered fearfully, and the enemy must have lost hundreds as our shot and shells kept bursting over the rifle pits." So he goes through the whole battle. The way he finally concludes it, he says, "I never expected to feel as I did on the occasion. After the first few shots, I felt perfectly self-possessed and ready to go anywhere we're ordered. This is a hasty outline of what occurred, but I must close, and if spared to survive another battle, I shall write as soon as possible." I can't help but imagine his mother's reaction to that closing, that if he's not killed in the next battle, he'll write home right after. They'll just see how it goes. And so they will then be moving up the peninsula. They will be pushing the Confederate defenses back. The Vermont soldiers, or Vermont Brigade's part of the 6th Corps, which at this point is under General Franklin, and they will make it to within about 12 miles of Richmond. And at that point then, General McClellan is going to call the invasion to a halt, feeling that the Confederate defenses were too strong ahead of them, that they will have to wait for further reinforcements. Of course, there are some historians that think with the numerical advantage the North had, they might have broken through and taken Richmond this early in the war. But at any rate, Henry's seen a lot of interesting things along the way, like, for example, the famous battle between the two ironclads. The Merrimack and Monitor has occurred. He was able to go get a real close-up look at the Monitor, and he actually was not very impressed. He didn't think ironclads were going to contribute much to the war. What he was much more impressed with was the use of the balloons. These hydrogen-filled balloons where they could get high up and see Confederate troop movements and defensive positions. Henry thought this was going to be the big innovation coming out of this campaign. But at any rate, things are about to change in the peninsula after General Joseph Johnston, severely wounded. Robert E. Lee takes over, and Lee decides the best way to protect Richmond is to go on the offensive, to attack out into the Union lines. And so we end up with this week of fighting called the 7 days, and Vermont Brigade will be involved in several parts of these because there's a lot of battles fought all through here in the 7 days. One place he's going to be fighting at is going to be at Savage's Station. At Savage's Station, the situation there was after the initial fighting, word that another large Confederate force was approaching, so the Union Army had to move out fast. And that included leaving their wounded soldiers behind, which Henry was not happy about at all. But, and I did find this photograph, which is wounded Union soldiers being left at Savage's Station. Another place he'll be heavily involved is at White Oak Swamp. Situation there is that Stonewall Jackson's coming from the Shenandoah Valley, and at White Oak Swamp, the 6th Corps soldiers there will be trying to stop his advance, and they do greatly slow him down. This is a drawing of the defenders there at White Oak Swamp. As a result, Jackson is not going to get to where Lee had hoped to use him later in the 7 days. But end result of all this is Union Army is pushed down to Malvern Hill. At that point, President Lincoln, feeling that McClellan has failed him, is going to reduce McClellan's authority, order the Army of Potomac to move up under General Pope's leadership, and then attack Richmond from the north. But the Army of Potomac will be moving rather slowly. Lee figures out what's going on, gets up there before much of the Army of the Potomac has arrived. And we'll fight a battle then on familiar grounds. They're back at Bull Run for the second battle of Bull Run. In that battle, the Pope thought he had Stonewall Jackson cornered, didn't realize he was being outflanked by Longstreet, and ends up being another Confederate victory. And so at that point, then, President Lincoln is no doubt wondering who he should get to lead this army, and will end up turning back to McClellan, giving him full authority again. And it's right at this point in the war that McClellan gets one of the biggest breaks then in the war, when Lee has decided to launch an invasion up into the north, moving up through Maryland. But he has his men very dangerously divided into small groups, and one of Lee's commanders accidentally leaves the orders behind the campsite. These lost orders get turned over to McClellan, so he now knows where the Confederates are located, that if he moves real fast, he might be able to wipe out each one of these smaller groups. He does not move real fast, but he does have some good reason, because this new information does not match well with a lot of the military intelligence reports he'd already received. And he's wondering, could this be a trick? Is Lee trying to pull him in too fast? But he will start moving towards where Lee is at. And Lee will be massing his men back together along Antietam Creek there at Sharpsburg as the Union Army moves that way. Now, in order to get there, they have to go through this mountain range, which is called South Mountain. And there are gaps that they have to go through. And so, like the Iron Brigade, I think is up here in the Turner's Gap, but the 6th Corps is down here at the Crampton's Gap. And so that's where Henry would be part of the charge to get through there. Lee will be, and in his letters, Henry talks about how he made the charge up the hill in the front line, at the very end of the front line, and this shows indeed the 4th Vermont is the end of the front line charging up. This drawing shows the charge up the hill, and and actually my wife and I have climbed this hill. It's actually much steeper and more difficult looking showing this drawing. But anyway, the end result of it all is that Confederates are greatly outnumbered. They will start to retreat, but they've done what they were sent there to do. They have slowed down McClellan's advance enough that Lee can get Moses' army reformed in to withstand the attack. And so after this fighting in this battle, Henry writes home, and he sounds like he's kind of had it with all this fighting. He says, "How long is this incessant fighting to continue? Ever since we left Washington, the cannon's been booming. Seems like a severe fight every day. I never before was exposed to such a galling fire. Many a bullet whistled seemingly very close to my head. But I did not seem feel like dodging. But it's a hard place to stand in. Trusting in the Lord to protect me, I go forward wherever I'm ordered." So he sounds like he's kind of like at the end of his rope, but he says, yeah, he's a soldier. He'll go wherever he's ordered. And where he's going to be ordered to is Antietam. The single bloodiest day of the Civil War is coming up next. And so, I imagine some of you have probably visited Antietam. You're familiar with how it starts very early in the morning, I think like 5 o'clock in the morning or so, with fighting up around the East Woods and down on the Dunker Church. Well, the 6th Corps isn't going to get there until about 11 o'clock in the morning. A lot of the heavy fighting's already taken place by that point. They had been sent down to help secure Harper's Ferry. So they're coming in now, and when they get there, they will make an advance where they make themselves known. They will be charging down towards the Sunken Road, Bloody Lane area. And this marker down by Bloody Lane shows where they made their advance. But then McClellan ordered the entire 6th Corps to fall back. That McClellan felt that, based on his intelligence reports, Lee's army should have been much larger than what he was seeing in front of him. He thought Lee was holding back a lot of men in reserve to bring out later. So McClellan will bring the 6th Corps back and hold them in reserve to be used later. For the rest of the battle, they're sitting on a hillside, just watching this battle unfold. And in fact, when we visited the battlefield, our guide was able to take us to the hillside so I could sit where the Vermont soldiers sat with the view they had as they're watching all this horrible carnage that's taking place. When the battle's all over, Henry writes home, "After the battle was the worst of sights. Every house was filled to the brim as thick as they could lie. Still there was no room. All the barns were filled the same way. Still there was no room. Hundreds had to lie out of doors. Many remained on the field 3 days. Many did not have their wounds dressed for 2 days. Their wounds in some instances became maggoty. The dead had to be piled in heaps and burned, as it was impossible to bury them all." Well, I showed that letter to one of the park rangers in Antietam, and he looked at that letter and said, "Do you realize what you have here?" He said, "We've heard stories that supposedly there were so many dead bodies to deal with after this battle that in some cases soldiers just stacked them up and burned them." He said, "I've never before seen a first-hand account." And here it was in Henry's letter saying he saw them doing this after the battle. Well, at any rate, Antietam, of course, is considered a Union victory because Lee has got to retreat to the south. But Lincoln does not really view it that way because he felt McClellan should have not allowed Lee to get away. And so we get a change in leadership now with McClellan being replaced by General Ambrose Burnside. And with Burnside, besides getting a new word in the English language with sideburns for his facial hair, we also get a new plan. And Burnside's plan is going to be to move very quickly the Army of the Potomac down towards Fredericksburg. Have pontoons brought down, create pontoon bridges, get across, go up onto the heights above Fredericksburg. From there, either Lee will have to attack him in that strong defensive position, or he can head on towards Richmond. And so he does, and so yeah, it's a good plan probably. It could have been a very successful plan if everything just fallen into place just right. And he does surprise Lee by moving the army so quickly down towards Fredericksburg, but they get down to the area and the pontoons have not yet arrived. And so they sit and they wait, and while they're waiting, the Confederate Army will arrive and put themselves up on the heights above Fredericksburg. So probably the prudent thing to have done would have been to say, well, this was a good plan, but it didn't work. We're going to have to try something else. But there are political issues. This is the middle of December, 1862. Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1st. Lincoln wants a big victory now. He does not want Emancipation Day to come and seem to be in a position of weakness. So he's put a lot of pressure on his generals to fight a battle now. And faced with that, Burnside will launch the attack once the pontoons finally arrive. It's going to be difficult just getting the pontoons into place, getting them facing enemy fire, and then eventually getting soldiers across the river, fighting through the town, building by building, and then ultimately trying to break through the Confederate defenses, especially on the other side of town with the stone wall defenses up above the town. And so, so for lots of these soldiers then, they will be heading through the town, heading up towards the famous stone wall area. But there is another part to this battle as well, and that is a couple miles downriver, more pontoon bridges were put in. In fact, Henry was part of the detail that installed these bridges. And this plan down here, with Franklin in charge, is going to be to try to break through Stonewall Jackson's defenses and get up behind the stone wall from this direction. Now, if you visit Fredericksburg, most people are spending their time up here because this is all national park. This area down here, where the Vermont soldiers are right along Deep Run Creek, right in this position, this area has become developed. In fact, where the Vermont soldiers were along Deep Run Creek, Today there is a Wawa convenience store. But when we visited, the creek is still there, and we had copies of Henry's letter, and we walked past the gas pumps in the convenience store and up alongside the creek, up to the high ground that Henry talked about where he was positioned. And so this is a blow up in the area then, so Deep Run Creek is up here, the Vermont Brigade soldiers right here, there's artillery behind them. I think the Iron Brigade is down in this area, if I'm correct, but protecting that flank area. But at any rate, for much of this battle, Vermont soldiers are in position, watching all these blue arrows, all these attacks, trying to break through this and getting turned back throughout this battle. But then all of a sudden, there is this red arrow coming right towards the Vermont soldiers. This is 2 North Carolina regiments that realized if they came up alongside the creek, broke through these Vermont soldiers, they could capture the artillery back behind them. So all of a sudden, Henry finds himself in the midst of the fighting. And so he writes home, the captain was detached, so I was in command of my company. Soon 2 regiments, that's 2 North Carolina regiments, came out and charged on us. The shot flew like hail around us. We had to lie and take it. I did not let my men retreat until they were within 10 rods of us. Found it useless to try to stop them any longer. I ordered the retreat, halted on the brow of the hill, all the time giving them a deadly fire. Just then I saw the 3rd regiment coming to my assistance. Well, as it turns out, Henry had a friend who was back in reserve watching this. His friend took out a pencil and a piece of paper and sketched what was happening, and that sketch ended up in with our letters. And so here it is. So they had been on the high ground, but he says that they decided to fall back. So this is the North Carolina troops that pushed them back. Right here it says 4th Vermont. So this is where Henry's at in this position as they've regrouped. And then the last thing I read to you was he said, and then the 3rd Vermont, right here it says 3rd Vermont, came to our assistance. And then the next thing he says is, also our batteries opened. So the cannon behind them was firing over their heads into the North Carolina troops. This staggered them. They turned and ran with us after them, and we retook our old position. They lost, I should judge, 100 men. The ground was strewed with dead all the way back to their old position, after which they ceased firing. So Vermont soldiers held their ground, but of course overall, Fredericksburg a terrible defeat for the Union Army. When it's all over, Henry writes, thus ended the fight. What we've accomplished, I do not see, I hope something. Our whole loss is reported 18,000. Sunday there was a flag of truce and the wounded brought off. I crossed the line Sunday and saw some of their dead and wounded where our regiment fought. The rebels are very friendly when the flag of truce is up. The lines immediately join each other and we exchange coffee for tobacco. The enemy are also very eager to have this war closed. So can you imagine after fighting like that, they call a ceasefire, both sides come out in the middle, shake hands, talk to each other, trade things back and forth, and then go back to their own side. Monday we were relieved and went back to the rear. That night, the whole army was ordered across the river, remained there ever since. I've been in battles before, but not one equal to this last one. How I ever escaped, I cannot imagine. Exposed to solid shot grape and canister rifle balls by the volley. It seems as though I must have been shielded by some unseen power. I was the object of sharpshooters, being so I could not get much cover. I could do nothing but stand up and see them fire at me. I had the privilege of seeing all that was going on, to see a rebel regiment advance on us, also to see a battle take place in the open field. I've seen enough, and hope never to see the like again. If ever I felt grateful, it was when darkness covered the field. So that's a real low point in the war with the Union defeat at Fredericksburg. But soon there will be new hope with a new commander, General Joseph Hooker. And Hooker will be given an enormous army, about 130,000 men, Lee with about 65,000, so a 2-to-1 advantage. Hooker comes up with a plan. The plan being he'll have his cavalry sweep around, breaking off supply lines for Lee. He will leave part of the army at Fredericksburg to attack from one side. He'll take most of the army to Chancellorsville. From there, be able to have troop movements all around to attack Lee from different directions and crush this small army that Lee has. So once again, sounds like a pretty good plan on paper, although it's just not going to quite work out that way, because General Lee will defy conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom being, if you're greatly outnumbered, at least you keep your army intact. You don't divide a small army. But Lee is going to do just that. He will leave part of his army at Fredericksburg, take the rest to face Hooker at Chancellorsville. And as for the Vermont Brigade, they are down here. This is the 6th Corps, which is left at Fredericksburg. So they are going to be charging up towards that stone wall defense area. And this is a photograph of 6th Corps soldiers just before the charge. Now, they don't know how heavily defended it is. This could be another suicide charge up that hill. But as it turns out, it's not as strongly defended this time by Jubal Early's forces. And the stone wall does fall. That Henry thought this was going to be a major turning point in the war. They'd finally taken the stone wall. But it turns out not mattering a great deal because of what happens over at Chancellorsville. That Lee has already divided his army once, now he'll divide it again, sending Stonewall Jackson back behind Hooker's troops, attacking from 2 directions. Hooker, taken so much by surprise, falls back, creates a sort of horseshoe-shaped defensive position, which enables Lee to divide his army again, to send part of his forces back towards the 6th Corps, which is coming from Fredericksburg. They fight a battle at Salem Church, and at Salem Church, 6th Corps is defeated. They're now under General Sedgwick. Sedgwick will order a retreat back across the river. When Hooker hears that Sedgwick's defeated, Hooker gives up and retreats as well. And so Chancellorsville, another defeat for the Union Army. It's seeming like no one can get the best of Robert E. Lee. But Lee is not all that pleased either, because Lee realizes with the numerical advantage the North has and the industrial might of the North, eventually Lincoln's going to find the right leader. He cannot just keep holding off these large armies forever. And so Lee's feeling is now is the time to launch an attack into the North. That he will start moving his army up through Maryland, heading up towards central Pennsylvania. The Union Army will be following behind. Union Army now under new leadership with General Meade. Well, the end result is that it's going to be a long, difficult march. It's in very hot weather. And the Vermont soldiers, Vermont Brigade, is going to be at the very end of the line. And this is a huge line, you got over 100,000 men. Vermont soldiers are at the very end protecting these supplies as they're moving north. And so Henry writes, "We are now on our way through Maryland in all possible haste. We are expecting one of the roughest campaigns we ever had. It's reported that 40 men have died on the road on account of the heat. Many are sunstruck. We never saw such hard marching before. We are covering the rear of the Potomac Army and have got the trains all safe within our lines. If this thing is properly managed, we will annihilate Lee's army. But we are dreadfully worn down. Pray for us. Thousands are to be sacrificed within the next few weeks." Well, as it turns out, you couldn't be much more prophetic than that. This is just 2 or 3 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. Henry says the next few weeks, thousands are going to be sacrificed, but this time we're going to do it. We're going to defeat General Lee's army. And so the end result is, because Gettysburg, of course, a 3-day battle, because the Vermont soldiers are at the very end of the line, they're not going to be there that first day when Union soldiers are pushed back through the town. They start to set up their famous fishhook defensive position. And in fact, they're not even there for most of the second day. This 6th Corps under General Sedgwick is coming in about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on day 2 of Gettysburg. So they've missed a lot of these famous engagements here in the Peach Orchard and Rosewoods and Chamberlain's Charge down Little Round Top and all that. But when they get there, they will be like I said, they missed a lot of things. But Henry does have a cousin who was there. It was kind of an interesting story. His cousin, George Smith, in the 17th U.S., and we have several of George's letters. He comes across as a very sort of fun-loving kind of guy, writing letters about the young girls they met along the way and parties they'd gone to and things. But at Gettysburg, he's going to be in a very difficult position. He will be fighting in the wheat field, where, of course, there's extremely heavy casualties. In the midst of that fighting, George Smith shot in the chest. Now, in the Civil War, if you are shot in the chest, your survival chances are not real good. In this particular case, the combination of distance and wind velocity and humidity and everything plays a part. He's hit with enough force, he's knocked to the ground, looks down, and finds the bullet had bounced off of his chest, but had not penetrated. And he's able to get back up and continue on, and ends up surviving the Civil War and having a real interesting life. He stayed in the Army after the Civil War, went out west, fought under General Sheridan in the Indian Wars, and then during the Gilded Age, came back east to Philadelphia, went into business, and by the end of the century, he was listed in the Philadelphia Blue Book as one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia society. But anyway, back to Henry and the Vermont soldiers. Once they finally get there, they're going to be, General Meade's going to place them in reserve behind the Round Tops. And so, of course, day 3 of Gettysburg is not going to involve the Round Tops. It's going to be a Pick's charge in the center that's going to be focused on. And so Vermont soldiers don't really do much at Gettysburg, or at least the Vermont Brigade does not. But because they haven't done a great deal, they will be sent to trail Lee's army as it retreats south. And there'll be some small engagements, fighting taking place. One of the battles takes place in Funkstown, Maryland. In Funkstown, Maryland, you only have a few hundred casualties, pales in comparison to the 51,000 plus at Gettysburg. But at Funkstown, Henry is one of the casualties. He is shot with shell fragments in the shoulder. And so he's going to be out of the war for a few months. He's going to be going back home to Williamstown to recover. And while he's back home, interesting thing happens in his life. He ends up engaged to be married. But we also know it was a secret engagement. So we had another mystery to try and figure out. Why a secret engagement? And we think we've got it pretty well figured out, because in with Henry's letters, there was also a small notebook. And in this notebook, he was keeping track of letters he'd sent and letters he'd received during the war. Well, up until this time, he had never corresponded with this young girl named Laura Ainsworth. Now, they're about the same age, from this small town. They must have known each other, but must not have been very close up until this time. Now he goes home on his medical leave for a few months. The two of them must have really hit it off. We know that they went on a picnic with a group of friends, and that he proposed. So we're thinking what must be going on here is probably they felt either her parents or his parents would not be happy about this whirlwind romance. He comes home from the war, just like that, they're engaged. But they're excited, they want to tell someone, so they tell their friends on the picnic, but then they tell them, don't tell anyone for 1 year. We're going to keep this a secret. And Henry then will head on back into the war. Well, actually not even into the war next. Next he heads for New York City. President Lincoln has called for a military draft. Draft riots broke out in a lot of the big cities, the worst being New York City, where hundreds of people were killed, thousands of injuries. The entire 6th Corps of the Army will be sent into New York City to maintain order. And so that's where Henry meets up with his regiment, has letters home talking about the give and take with the local people, people asking what they're going to do there, how they're going to try to maintain order. But it's also this time Henry's brother Francis finally enters the war. So Francis is the older brother, but he had stayed out of the war up until this time. That Francis, he's got a lot of problems. He's got physical problems like stomach disorders. He's also seems to have kind of psychological or kinds of problems. He seems to have suffered from depression. or what they would have called melancholy back in those days. So he stayed out of the war to this point. Now he will join up. Why now? Maybe it's because there's a draft. He's thinking he's going to get drafted anyhow. Maybe he's interested in making money, that there are all the different bounties paid by different levels of government. He might be joining for that reason. Then also there's just a lot of pressure on young guys to do their part and join up. So for whatever reason, he will join. He also is someone who writes very well. He is going to secretly work as a war correspondent for the Vermont Chronicle and Watchman, based out of Montpelier. And when we found out his pen name, we were able to go to Montpelier, where they had 19th century newspapers on microfilm, and go through and find all 12 of his dispatches he sent back to the newspaper, and include those in the book along with the letters. But at any rate, he will be joining up in the Vermont Brigade, and he, a different regiment than Henry, was still in the Vermont Brigade. And as I said, he's got a lot of problems. Like, well, for one thing, he doesn't seem to have much in the way of friends. In one of his early letters, he says to his parents, he says he doesn't like going over to his brother's camp because there's so many young guys from Williamstown there. There's a lot of people from his hometown he doesn't want to see. But the funny thing about Francis is that this war that's going to destroy so many young men physically and emotionally, Francis is going to really thrive in this environment. He's going to do very well as a soldier. He's going to start becoming healthier than he's been in a long time. He'll attribute it to the outdoor living, making him healthy. He likes the food. One of his letters home, he writes to his parents, he says that camp food agrees with him more than home cooking does, which must have made his mother feel great. She got that letter. But at any rate, he'll do well in the early training, because Henry writes home, tells his parents, yeah, Francis is holding up well. They've been on a long march. He's doing really good. They, in another letter, Henry writes to his parents. He said he was over to visit Francis at his camp. And he says to his parents, he says, and Francis was happy. And he underlines the word happy. Like, can you believe it? Francis is happy. And he said he has friends. He's doing well. And he'll eventually get involved in some military campaigns, fighting under General Meade in the Bristow campaign, and then in Mine Run. It holds up well there. But things are about to go very, very badly for the Vermont Brigade. General Grant, recalled from the West, will be taking control over the Army of the Potomac and having the Army move in what's called the Overland Campaign, starting off with the Battle in the Wilderness. And the Battle of the Wilderness, the Vermont soldiers ended up in a real bad position that initially a lot of the fighting involved the 5th Corps, but then came word another Confederate Corps is moving up the Orange Plank Road up towards the intersection with the Brock Road. Grant realized if the Confederates take this intersection, they can divide his army and defeat it. And so, Vermont Brigade will be detached from up here from the 6th Corps, detached down to that intersection. Hancock's 2nd Corps is to move forward together to hold that intersection. Unfortunately, Hancock does not get the orders right away. Vermont soldiers arrive first. And they will hold their position. At this point in time, well, this marker shows where they made their stand. At this point, there were 2,800 men in the Vermont Brigade. There will be 1,234 casualties just at this spot. But they will hold it long enough that Hancock's Corps arrives together, they hold that position, and that helps Grant to win this battle in the Wilderness. Among the casualties is both Henry and Francis. Francis shot alongside the neck. It was not life-threatening. Henry shot in the chest. And as it turns out then, Henry will die. 3 days later, Henry dies. His brother by his side, able to write home to his parents about Henry's death. At that point, Francis will recover in a hospital in Fredericksburg as Grant keeps moving south and Lee keeps moving to block him. Francis will finally get out of the hospital. He reports back The day of the Battle of Cold Harbor, the terrible Union defeat there, is the day he arrives. He'll then be, as Grant decides to move south of Richmond and attack Petersburg to break off supply lines. France will be part of the siege there at Petersburg. But then, 6th Corps is going to be sent up into the Shenandoah Valley under General Sheridan. There was going to be a surprise attack, Jubal Early early morning attack at Cedar Creek, taking Union forces by surprise. Early part of that fighting, Francis saw a friend go down. He goes over to try to help him. In the process, Francis is shot just above the ankle. He'll then be taken to a military field hospital, probably something very similar to this one, which is not the kind of place you want to be, of course, in the Civil War. This is an example of a surgeon's kit. Surgeon's kit composed largely of saws and blades because the great danger is infection. They don't have penicillin or antibiotics, but if you amputate, you might be able to stop infection from spreading. Francis is going to be told they don't know what they're going to have to do. He's given chloroform and put out. He'll wake up in an outside recovery area, probably like this one, to find that they had amputated the lower portion of his leg. He'll then be sent to a hospital up in Washington, D.C., such as this one, to recover. But there, the doctors found the amputation was done so poorly that they decided they had to do a second amputation, much further up his leg. Now, his doctor was from Vermont and was keeping his own medical book where he would take a photograph of his patient and paste it on one side on the page, and then do a handwritten account of the treatment of the patient on the other side. And we were able to find Dr. Jane's book up in the special collections of the University of Vermont, and that's where we found this photograph of Francis after the second amputation, now up above his knee. He'll then go through a long recovery process, and during this time also he writes back to the newspaper. He says, as this is the last of my series of letters, starts off, 19th of October, now of historic note, was an episode in my life ending my career as a soldier and necessitating me to act for the remainder of my days in a sphere entirely different from what I would have chosen. And he then tells the story of being shot at Cedar Creek and the 2 amputations. And he says, as this is the last of my series of letters as an Army correspondent, I will say in conclusion that while I regret the casualty which has befallen me, still it's only the fortune of a soldier, and I do not regret that I responded to my country's call, nor feel that I've served to no purpose in a just cause. Though I've never done all I could wish as a soldier, still I've endeavored to do my duty, not shrinking hardship when called upon, and I am satisfied. If others wish to engage in the same service, I would say to them that the chances are that their lot may end up similar to my own. But the cause is worthy of the sacrifice, and I would bid them go forward. So after all he's endured, he's saying it's worth it for the cause they've been fighting for. And he will go then through this long recovery process. Eventually he'll decide to get a prosthetic leg. We had them with our letters, the actual brochure that he ordered the leg from. We had the doctor's report showing just what he needed for this new leg. And it will arrive, and he will make it back to the family farm there in Williamstown, where he will live happily for about 6 weeks. At that point, we found the newspaper account of what happened next. The newspaper article was entitled, "Shocking Accident." The article will explain that Francis and his father had gone off in their farmland. There was a big boulder they wanted to get rid of, so they dug a hole, and they were going to pry the boulder into the hole. But they couldn't budge it. So the father, Chester, went back to get more help. While he was gone, we can only guess what happened, but my guess is Francis wanted to show, even on one leg, he could still do heavy farm labor, tried to move the boulder himself. When he didn't return home, his mother came looking for him and found him crushed to death beneath the boulder that had fallen back over on top of him. But he had said that regardless of what happens, the cause they're fighting for has made this all worthwhile. And for those of us that spent many years on this whole project, it was real worthwhile for us back in those early days, going up to Vermont, getting all the records we could find on births and deaths and marriages and military records and putting the whole story together, putting together a family tree. Way back when my hair was still brown, we were able to make this connection to the soldiers. And then eventually put together the book, Voices from the Attic, telling their story. You know, when I first found the letters, I remember telling my younger daughter a little bit about finding all these Civil War letters. I told her, maybe someday I'll even write a book about it. She thought about that for a moment and said, well, do you think you could add in some vampires? That would make it a much better story, but I don't think we really needed the vampires. It ended up being a pretty good story as it is. So that is my story. Thank you all for listening. And thank you. And do we have time for questions then? Is that right? Yes. Do you want to use this microphone for the questions?
Did you ever find a connection between your family and the letters? Do you know how the letters ended up in your attic?
Yeah, it took us a long time, but the way this all seems to fall into place is that the father, Chester Martin, had 4 children. Two of them died young, and then the 2 boys die in the war. And then his wife dies right after the war. So he's approaching 70 years old. He's alone on this big farm by himself. Ends up getting married a second time. He marries a woman named Adelia Hill, a widow, and she had a daughter. Her daughter, Lucia, married to Benjamin Sibley. They had gone out west, out to Kansas under the Land Grant Act. So they're out in Kansas with their children. But now Chester Martin, his new wife, they contact the Sibleys and say, would you come back to Vermont and help us work this farm? And it'll be yours someday. So the Sibleys return, including a 4-year-old daughter named Bernice. Bernice will grow up and marry my grandfather. Now, as it turns out, Bernice died rather young too. She died in her 40s. And then my grandfather married my grandmother. But we're thinking, as a 4-year-old coming back to Vermont, she had this new grandfather in Chester Martin. He probably talked about his sons a lot, read some of these letters to her. She must have valued them enough to take these letters with her into her marriage. And then when she died, and my grandfather married my grandmother, the letters would have still been there. When my grandparents had died by the 1980s, my father went up to Vermont, emptied out their house. So I'm thinking he probably found this box of very old letters, brought them back to Pittsburgh, and thought, I'm going to have to look at these someday, and put them up in his attic. And that's where I found them about 15 years ago. And so the letters had just bounced around from attic to attic over all this time. And then I found them. Here I was, someone with a history background, looking for a retirement project. Plus, on top of that, I can read cursive writing. There's if another generation or two, if these letters hadn't been found, people might have been looking at these letters saying, what is this? You know, but we were able then to put it all together, and so that is the connection to the soldiers. Anything else? Yes?
Whatever happened to the woman that Henry was engaged to?
Yeah. Okay, so Laura Ainsworth, the woman he was engaged to, what happened to her? Kind of interesting story there too. That Laura Ainsworth does get married a few years later. She marries a distant cousin named James Edward Ainsworth. James was a civil engineer with railroad companies out west. Becomes very wealthy. In fact, it's the town Ainsworth, Nebraska, named for him. They have no children. When he dies, she's this very wealthy widow, comes back to this little town of Williamstown, Vermont, and becomes almost kind of a lesser version of Andrew Carnegie, just giving her wealth away. And so in Williamstown today, the local library is the Laura Ainsworth Memorial Library. Outside the town is Ainsworth State Forest, with land she gave to the state. And nearby Norwich University is Ainsworth Hall, with money she gave there. She gave money to fire companies and schools, all sorts of things. Ended up having a real interesting life. Anything else? Oh, Yes, sir.
How rare is it to get a first-hand sketch of the battlefield?
Yeah, it certainly is rare. It was funny, well, I don't know if very many of you are familiar with Frank O'Reilly at Fredericksburg. He's written, probably the best book in the Battle of Fredericksburg. In fact, the first time we went to Fredericksburg, we were just beginning. I didn't know much of anything, and I had a copy of the letter from Fredericksburg. And I saw someone that seemed to be part of the staff there, and went up to him and said, asked him if he knew very much about the battle. And this is the foremost expert on the battle in the country. And he said, yeah, I know that, and told me how to get started and all this. But I showed him that sketch, and he asked to have a copy to put in the museum there at Fredericksburg, because that is really rare for a soldier to have the time and everything right there, and just say, oh, I think I'll sketch what's happening during this fighting. Anything else? Okay, I'll mention the book is available on Amazon. It's $19.95, or as they say on TV, if you act now. I did bring some along. So the books I bought, it's the same $19.95, but I paid shipping, handling, taxes, that's all covered. And to keep things really simple, for an additional 5 cents, to make it even 20, you can even have it signed by the author. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And on behalf of the Roundtable, I'd like to present this Certificate of Honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Carleton Young for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
But you're not done yet.
Okay.
On behalf of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee, which is the custodian of the Iron Brigade Association as established by the veterans, it gives me great pleasure to present a pin signifying membership in the association to Carleton Young.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
One other piece of housekeeping. I was informed that they have someone's house keys at the front desk. So double check before you leave.
Thanks again, Carl. That was incredible research on that. You obviously anticipated some of the questions.
I've done enough time to know what's coming. Yeah, right.
Anyway, thank you, and I'll see you over at the signing table for the 5-cent signing bonus. With that, we'll end the program, and as you can see from the poster on the front of the lectern here, our next meeting will be November 9th, right here at the Wisconsin Club, so we hope to see all of you then. Take care.
Thanks. Just want to grab my water.